Good afternoon. I'm Cynthia Shore, the Executive Director of the Walt Whitman Birthplace, and it gives me great pleasure to receive you here today for our fourth program in our series this year, African American Voices of Democracy, Intersections. And today, the intersection is between Long Island history and poet Jupiter Hammon. We have some of his poetry here behind me on the screen, and we will be getting to that during our program. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our special guests, and I will welcome them all individually, and then I will introduce them and have them come up. So our first guest today, our special guest, is Robert Hughes, the Huntington Town Historian. Welcome, Robert. Good to see you. Our second guest is Lauren Brincat, and she is the Curator of Preservation of Long Island. And welcome, Lauren. And David Mills is our poet who will be here shortly, and he will be speaking about Jupiter Hammon's poetry and reading his own poetry. So without further ado, let me introduce our special guest and friend and colleague, Robert Hughes. Robert Hughes is a Huntington Town Historian. Prior to his appointment as town historian in January 2002, he served as an acting executive director of the Huntington Historical Society and was a member of the Huntington Historic Preservation Commission. Mr. Hughes was a member of the Huntington Historical Society Board of Trustees for 6.5 years, including 3 years as president. As town historian, Mr. Hughes serves as secretary to the Huntington Historic Preservation Commission and the African American Historic Destination Council. He works with all the heritage organizations in town to assist them in achieving their missions of preserving and sharing Huntington's history. He also serves on the Preservation Committee of the Society for the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities. He is the author of Cold Spring. He is author of Cold Spring Harbor and co-author of Northport, part of Arcadia Publishing's Images of American series. He has also written numerous articles about various aspects of Huntington's history, which can be found at www.huntingtonhistory.com. In 2003, when Huntington celebrated the 350th anniversary of its founding, Mr. Hughes produced a video history of the Huntington town. It gives me great pleasure. I've worked with Robert as my time here as executive director, and indeed, all these historic titles in front of his name is what he is best at and what he does for the town. So, Robert, please come up.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. This is the first hybrid presentation that I've been a part of from presenting in person to people here at Walt Whitman Birthplace, also going out. So it's an exciting new world, happy to be a part of it. But today I'm going to talk about, as I usually do, the old world, the things that used to be part of our history here in the town of Huntington. And the topic that I'm going to speak at is slavery in the town of Huntington, to put in context the life and experience of Jupiter Hammon, we'll hear about more later. And I just wanted to talk with a little discussion of terminology. We've always talked about slaves and owners, masters, and it's really inappropriate because it dehumanizes the person who is enslaved. It defines them by the condition that they find themselves in. So we prefer to say that someone is enslaved or has been enslaved. And the person will be formerly called the owner, the master, we call the enslaver. And people don't necessarily run away, they self-emancipate. There can be a lot of different aspects to this. It might get a little confusing. And growing up saying one way for the past 60 years, if I slip up, I can do that and use the old terminology. But I try to make every effort to be sensitive and respectful in dealing with this. And, so please bear with me, and if you hear me say something that you haven't heard before, that's probably. But slavery in the town of Huntington. The town was founded in 1653, and we knew there was at least one slave here as early as 1660. There are no direct records of the slave experience here in town, but through other town records, we find references to people being enslaved. So in 1660, there was a court case in which a woman was accused of stealing fabric from her neighbor and engaging one of the enslaved men in town to help her in that effort. So that's how we know that Thomas Matthews, as early as 1660, had enslaved someone. Beyond that, the records are really very scarce until you get to 1755, when there was a census done of the enslaved population of Long Island, actually throughout the colony of New York. At that time, in the town of Huntington, which included not just the current town of Huntington, but also the town of Babylon, there were 84 persons who were enslaved in 54 households. And there were about 360 households in the town, so 15% of households had enslaved people. The enslaved population have to make a lot of assumptions about how big a household was, because records were really only kept by household. They didn't count the wife and the children in the census records back then. So I would assume there were probably about 1,800 people in town. So the enslaved population is 6% of the total population, more or less, 5 to 6%. And the average size of the number of enslaved people per household is about 1.5, which is typical for Long Island. And different than the plantation system we see later on in the South. But slavery was just as much a part of northern life as southern life in the colonial period. In fact, New York City, the enslaved population may have been as high as 20% of the population, which is comparable to some of the southern states in the colonial period. Of course, after the invention of cotton gin, slavery really increased tremendously in the South. The 1790 census, which is the first time the federal census, we can really start getting good numbers that we see consistently year after year. There were 213 enslaved persons in the town, which is the highest number that the town had ever experienced. Still about 6% of the overall population were enslaved. Now, just to give you a sense of what it was like to be enslaved. So, of those 84 people who were enslaved in 1755, one of them was a man named Dick. And his life experience is really indicative of the tenuousness of life and the lack of control when you were enslaved and what it meant to be enslaved. He'd been born around 1720. He was enslaved by John Hewlett of Oyster Bay. But then when he was 34 years old, he was sold to Benjamin Jarvis of Huntington for 70 pounds. And then in the next few years, he moved enslaver to enslaver many times. 1760, sold to Thomas Jarvis. 1761, to Sotomayor Platt. 2 years later, to Jonathan Scudder. 1766, to Solomon Ketchum for 50 pounds. So you can see in that 12-year period, his value had dropped from 70 pounds to 50 pounds. Even though he was only 46 years old, his most productive years were behind him. The fight of slavery, you can see reflected in people trying to sell it. You used to call it in front of us. There would be advertisements in the papers, in New York City papers, of a reward. Here's one for Gilbert Valentine Place. Gilbert Valentine, West Hills, right up this way, this neighbor of the Whitmans. He was offering a $20 reward for the return of Charles, who was about 3 years of age. This escaped and made his way probably into the city, which was a location where many people went because you could get on a ship and sail out. You could mingle in with a larger crowd and maybe have a better chance of freedom from the city than you would on Long. Another instance in 1767, Joseph Lewis placed an ad for 2 enslaved men who had run away, Daniel, age 21, and Benjamin, age 13. And then 5 years later, we see another ad for Benjamin's return. So Benjamin obviously was brought back to the John Lewis household, but then made this escape again. So obviously people did not want to be enslaved. It was not, some people say, well, in the North it was more benign and it wasn't as bad as being in the South. But it was just as bad. And one of the things you see in these runaway ads is many of the people were scarred as a young person. You know, so he had a scar on his left cheek or a scar on his leg. and from a scalding. And you have to wonder whether it was a case of an accident or was that punishment. That part of their punishment they were scalded, which is probably very likely the case. The inhumanity of slavery is also exhibited in a letter that is in the collection of the Huntington Historical Society, written by Silas Wood in 1817. Silas Wood was the first historian of Long Island and later would be elected to Congress to represent Suffolk County in Congress. He had been asked by Benjamin Horton what the legal status of a baby born to an enslaved woman was. This woman was hired out to Benjamin Horton by its owner by her owner for an 8-year period, and then she was to be free, granted her freedom. But during that 8-year period, she had a baby. So Benjamin Horton said, "What is the legal status of this baby?" And the legal advice that Silas Wood gave was based on the laws at the time that people who were enslaved were treated no differently than domestic animals. So if you had a horse who became pregnant while it was on loan to someone else, the offspring of that horse becomes the property of the person who had borrowed the horse. So in this case, even though the mother was going to be free at the end of her term, the child would remain enslaved. Now, the letter was written in October of 1817. In March of that year, New York State had passed the law for the final abolition of slavery, but it wouldn't take effect for another 10 years. And I'll explain how that all worked later. So even at that late date when slavery was on its way out of the state of New York, those inhumane rules still applied. Now, just to give you some statistics on numbers of people who were enslaved, according to the federal census in the early years of the Republic, as I said, in 1790, 213 people in the town of Huntington were enslaved. There were 74 free people of color at that time. By 1800, there were 185 enslaved, 1810, 53, and by 1820, 31, and by 1830, 3 years after the sort of official end of slavery in New York State, there were 0 people enslaved in New York, in the town of Huntington. And part of that is individual actions by enslavers to manumit their slaves. They were authorized to do that by a 1785 law in New York State. Prior to that, you could not grant freedom to your slave without posting a bond. But in 1785, the New York State legislature said you could manumit people who were enslaved without posting a bond, provided they were under the age of 50 and could take care of themselves. And this is something that Jupiter Hammon writes a bit about in his poetry, which Lauren, I'm sure, will touch on. The fear was that you would have someone who could not take care of himself either because he was too old or he was disabled, and it would become the responsibility of town taxpayers to care for this person. The overseers of the poor would have to rule on whether this person was indeed under the age of 50, which they didn't necessarily have records of your birth, and then just look at them and say, looks like he's under 50, and was sufficient mind and body to take care of himself. So in 1820, the Compton family of Cold Spring Harbor manumitted Charles and Experience, who had been enslaved by their parents. So the parents had recently died. The children had inherited them and immediately manumitted them. And you see that sort of thing over and over. In 1809, New York State allowed people of color, Black people, to own property and to marry for the first time. Prior to that. So as I said, the overseers of the poor would have to certify that someone was able to take care of himself. Typical language was that he's under 50 years of age with sufficient ability to provide for and maintain himself, and therefore the overseers of the poor consent to his manumission. The other, before I get to the other thing, here's Peter Fleet. Similar to Dick, who I described earlier on the 1755 census. Peter Fleet was born into slavery in the household of Isaac Skidmore. At the age of 10, he was sold to Gilbert Fleet. Then he was sold to Augustine Fleet and Rensselaer Fleet and lived with them for about 14 years. Then he was sold to Benjamin Van Wyck of Oyster Bay, then to Thomas Smith of Oyster Bay, Benjamin Bailey of Brookhaven, John Smith of Smithtown, and back to Bailey, and then sold to Simon Siren of North Hempstead. And after 3 years with Simon, he received his freedom and returned to Huntington, where he married and had 7 children. So you can just see he had no agency over his own destiny for all those years until he gained his freedom. In contrast, James, who had been enslaved by Samuel Ketchum, was manumitted in 1799. And this is one of the most evocative things I found in the manumission papers on file with the town of Huntington. Solomon Ketchum said, I hereby grant him full power to go where he may see fit. Unlike Peter Fleet, who was forced to go from household to household across Long Island, Smithtown, Brookhaven, or Hempstead, James was now able to go wherever he saw fit. If you, under the 1799 law, it was gradual, you mentioned 1799 law, as in 1785, you could manumit without posting bond. In 1799, the New York State Legislature passed a law for the gradual emancipation of slaves. And it was sort of a compromise. Instead of immediate freedom for all the enslaved, you had a number of years of service from people born after July 4th, 1799. They would remain in your service until boys reached the age of 28 and girls reached the age of 25. People born before 1799 would continue to be enslaved. And under this gradual emancipation, an enslaver had to declare within the first year of the child's birth, had to record that birth. And they had the option at that time to either abandon the child or to keep the child as their servant until they reached the age 25 or 28. Oh, so if you abandoned the child, that just meant, in fact, you were granting freedom, but you didn't have to take care of that child anymore. So you would, after the child turned 1, you would turn it over to the overseers of the poor, and the overseers of the poor would then bound that person out to someone in the community. New York State would reimburse you $3.50 if you took in a formerly enslaved child. So if you had a child and you wanted to abandon it, you would turn it over to the overseers of the poor, and they might give the child right back to you and pay you for taking care of the child until you reach the age of majority. And you get service out of the child in the meantime. By 1817, the state decided to grant all enslaved persons born before July 4th, 1799, their freedom. In effect, 10 years later, in 1827. So that should have been the end of slavery, but if you have a child born before that date and after 1799, they could remain enslaved. So slavery technically could have existed in New York State as late as 1848, or in some cases maybe into almost 1860. I just know in the town of Huntington, there were no more people enslaved by 18. So it did have its effect as required. So the overseers of the poor would hire people out just because someone had to take care of the indigent, whether they were formerly enslaved or otherwise unable to care for themselves. And there would be, a hiring up process where people would ask a different price. And the overseers of the poor would pay you to take care of someone. And depending on your age, the value would change. If you were older and couldn't do any work, you would get more money for taking in that person. If you were younger and able to do work and help to support yourself within that household, you would receive less money from the overseers. Now, they say that in a lot of places, I think Smithtown noticed this in particular, they had, it seems, more enslaved people than we had in the town of Huntington. But after manumission, they had much fewer. So it seems the people who were free immediately tried to leave the town of Smithtown. Whereas in the town of Huntington, we do see a 50% increase in the population of people of color between 1820 and 1830. And it seems there must be more economic opportunities here that would attract people near the town. So we have a couple of examples. Peter Prince was born in Westchester, where he lived until he was 37 years old in 1819. And then he came to Huntington, died a resident of the courthouse in 1836. Thomas Treadwell had been born in Brooklyn, came to Huntington when he was 35 years old. Ellis Arden was born in Westchester, came to Huntington in 1817. So you see a lot of people coming from other places to the town of Huntington. And many people, formerly enslaved in the town of Huntington, would move to probably the North Amityville area today and intermarry with the indigenous population. And some people think, well, where are all the indigenous people? There's so much intermarriage, people don't realize that a lot of the people of color that live in town today do trace their roots back to the earliest enslaved people in the indigenous residents of Wyoming. And I mentioned the number of enslaved people in 1755 was 84 in the town of Huntington. That did not include Lloyd Neck, which at the time was part of the town of Oyster Bay. Henry Lloyd had 8 enslaved people on his property, which increased later by his descendants as high as 15 at any one time. And one of those people was Jupiter Hammon, whose life you'll hear more about from Lauren, and stretches that whole period from 1711 until the beginning of marriage. So we'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Robert. How about another round of applause? I also wanted to say hello to our guests who are in the virtual land. So if you are out there, we are taking questions at the end of the program. So you can go ahead and type them in the chat group and we will take note of them and ask them at the end of the program. And we will ask questions of all of our speakers at the same time. All right. It is a great pleasure now to introduce Lauren Brincat. She is the Curator of Preservation of Long Island, a regional organization with a mission to celebrate and preserve Long Island's diverse cultural and architectural heritage through advocacy, education, and stewardship of historic sites and collections. Lauren has worked in New York museums and historical societies for over a decade, specializing in exhibition and program development, curation, and collections management. She is currently the Vice President of the Long Island Museum Association and a member of the Museum Advisory Committee at the Brown House Historical Society in Flushing, Queens. She previously held positions at the New York Historical Society and the Museum of the City of New York. Lauren's current curatorial work emphasizes community and institutional collaboration across the region with the initiatives such as the Jupiter Hammon project, which we will hear more about shortly, and the Art of Edward Lang project. Lauren is a graduate of the Addingham Summer School and holds a BA in History and Anthropology from the College of William and Mary and an MA from the University of Delaware's Winthrop program in American Material Culture with a certificate in museum. Very, very qualified to have her here today, which is one of the reasons that we reached out, our society reached out. And I would like to add that we every year have a series of programs that are sponsored by the Humanities New York, and this series is one of them this year, the African American Voices of Democracy. So I'd like to give a shout out to the Humanities New York program that sponsors this, and also a shout out to the town of Huntington, Suffolk County, and the state of New York Parks who support our programs and our association here. Okay, Lauren, are you ready? Come on.
Thank you so much. I have some slides, so I'm going to just pull up my computer. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much, Robert, for that great setup to what I'm going to be talking about now. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and to everyone online on Zoom. It's just always a treat for me to share Jupiter Hammond's story and the work that we're doing at Preservation Long Island. Before I dive into that, I want to tell you a little about who we are and what we do. So Preservation Long Island, we're committed to working with Long Islanders to celebrate and preserve the region's diverse cultural heritage. We are a small institution with a very large mission, which we accomplish through three main program areas. So the first one, of course, being educational programming. So this includes scholarly panels, publications, school programs, exhibitions. We also do preservation advocacy. So we work with individuals and organizations, community groups to support historic preservation in communities across Long Island. And then, of course, there's the stewardship aspect of what we do. So we collect significant objects of Long Island's material culture and interpret them. We also own and operate 4 historic sites across Long Island, which you can see on this map here. So our headquarters is located in the 1842 Methodist Episcopal Church in Main Street in Cold Spring Harbor, which serves as our exhibition gallery and our offices. And then we have 3 historic sites that we operate as house museums. That includes the Custom House all the way on the east end on Main Street in Sag Harbor. There is the Sherwood Jane Farm in Setauket, and then of course Joseph Lloyd Manor here in the town of Huntington, located in Lloyd Harbor. Each of these properties date to before the legal end of slavery in New York, as Robert just discussed with us, and present for us powerful opportunities to engage visitors in critical discussions about the complexities of gradual emancipation in New York and the legacies of enslavement and colonialism in New York and in the United States. Of course, of particular relevance to the theme today is Joseph Lloyd Manor, which was once the seat of a vast colonial provisioning plantation, then known as the Manor of Queens Village, that was established in the late 17th century. By the time this house was completed in 1767, slavery was well established in the North, and New York, and particularly Long Island, held more people in bondage than anywhere north of Maryland. So at Queens Village, both McKinney-Cox and enslaved people of African descent not only labored, but survived, created families, and made major contributions to American history and culture. As Robert mentioned, so all of the Manor of Queens Village was all of Lloyd Neck today. It was a provisioning plantation that shipped various natural resources and products that were harvested from the neck to market, whether that's in New York City, in Manhattan, or down to provision in massive enslaved workforces on sugarcane plantations in the West Indies. And at one time, there were approximately 10 to 15 people enslaved here by the Lloyd family. This was the second house that the Lloyds constructed on Lloyd Neck. The first one was the Henry Lloyd Manor House, built in 1711. It is where Jupiter Hammon was born into slavery. But it is at Joseph Lloyd Manor that Jupiter Hammon penned 2 of his most significant works, and both in 1786. So on the left, there is an address to the Negroes in the state of New York. And this was dedicated to the African Society, an influential Black activist group based in Manhattan. And it's a really complicated and interesting piece, and which Robert alluded to. So it's authored in 1786. And in it, Hammond, expresses his desire to see the young gain their freedom, but actually writes about how freedom is not something that he hoped to experience, because you need to think about the context of the time and his age in this moment. So he's 75 years old. So thinking about the fact that if he were to be, manumitted, there is no social safety network that would be able to support him. And so the indifferent manumission of the elderly resulted in someone like Jupiter Hammon unable to care for themselves and falling into poverty. So you really need to think about the complicated moment in his age and status in this particular time. But also authored at the same time as an address to Negroes in New York is an essay on slavery, which is the sharpest critique of American chattel slavery. It was never published, and it's interesting to think why that was the case. And this poem was recently, in the last decade, discovered in the archives of Yale University Library and really transformed how we thought about Jupiter Hammon and his feelings about enslavement in this time. Hammond survived 90 years of enslavement at Queens Village, except for the time that he was in exile in Connecticut during the American Revolution, and ultimately was enslaved by 4 generations of the Lloyd family. But Hammond was not, the only person enslaved by the Lloyd family. He was one of more than 45 people the Lloyds enslaved that we know of for over a century. And so all of these names, these are mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and uncles. People like Aurelia, who was a talented spinner that the Lloyds profited off of by selling her skills to others for £8 a year, or Michael Cox, a gifted musician who seized his own freedom and self-emancipated and fled Joseph Lloyd Manor with his violin and sheet music. So it's interesting to think about him and Hammond living enslaved at Joseph Lloyd Manor at the same time. Hammond was not the only enslaved person who knew how to read. Michael Cox certainly did, and we also know that Hammond's father, Obium, learned to read as well, and it is from Obium that Hammond inherited a prayer book with the Psalms. So for Preservation Long Island, being the steward of Joseph Lloyd Manor and its surrounding landscape is a really special responsibility, and we recognize the importance of this house as a place of history, of memory, and reconciliation. On the surface, it is a beautiful mid-18th century Georgian mansion with stunning views of Lloyd Harbor, but the history of this place, like the entire United States, is one deeply rooted in slavery and settler colonialism. So Preservation Long Island is doing a lot of work to rethink how we tell this history and engage the public with these stories. So in 2019, we launched the Jupiter Hammon project to begin reckoning with this difficult past and to work with community stakeholders, so that's descendants of local communities of color, and anyone else who feels strongly connected to this history, to work with us to establish a more relevant and equitable interpretation of this house, of Joseph Lloyd Manor, an interpretation that encourages meaningful dialogue about this history and its direct connection to the systemic racial disparities that people of color living on Long Island continue to experience today. So this next part of my presentation, I'm going to dive into some of the work that we're doing with the Jupiter Hammon project, what we've done already, what we're working with at the house right now, and where we're going in the future. So just to give you some background, we first acquired Joseph Lloyd Manor in 1968 from the last private owner, Anna Matheson Wood. So after a decades-long research-driven, intensive restoration and interpretation campaign, we opened the house to the public for the first time in 1982. And this interpretation really focused on the elite lifestyles of the Lloyd family. It focused on early American craftsmanship and also the decorative arts. And what resulted, which you can see here, was a series of high-style period rooms that were furnished according to a 1793 inventory of the estate. So this inventory was taken after the death of John Lloyd II, Joseph Lloyd's nephew, who inherited the house and all of Joseph's property, including the things in the house and the people Joseph enslaved, including Jupiter Hammon. Joseph Lloyd never had any children, never married, so the house went to his nephew. And so this document really guided what happened in the house. It determined the period of interpretation that our organization focused on. So 1793, the post-revolutionary period. And despite the documentation of 8 enslaved people in that inventory, including Jupiter Hammon, who is written there, these spaces emphasize an elite white cultural perspective and really do ignore the presence of the men, women, and children the Lloyds enslaved. The initial interpretation didn't even talk about slavery, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, we did begin to talk about Jupiter forceful programming, and this is also right after the discovery of the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan. So this is certainly influencing what happens at the house during that moment. But 40 years later, that initial 80s interpretation is still very much present in the house today, and something that we are now working to change. Before I dive into what we've accomplished with the project, I do want to show a quick video that we released to officially launch the Jupiter Hammon project. It's wonderful because it's a nice drone perspective of the area and just really gives you a sense of the landscape. So that was put out in 2020, and what we did to really begin working on this project was we formed a Jupiter Hammon Project Community Advisory Council, working with representatives from the town of Huntington Town American Historic Designation Council, and began to plan what we were going to do. So we officially kicked off the Jupiter Hammon Project in the summer of 2020 with a series of roundtables that brought scholars, professionals, and stakeholders together to discuss Long Island's role in the larger Black Atlantic world. So asking this question, why did Long Island have one of the largest enslaved populations during the colonial period? The second roundtable really zoomed in on the voice of Jupiter Hammon and his own poetry, trying to think about this question: what do Hammond's writings tell us about him as an educated individual surviving within the structure of enslavement? And then the last roundtable, we talked about, how we can best engage the public with this history, with these stories, and brought in professionals from other historical organizations, Joe McGill from the Slave Dwelling Project, to really have an in-depth conversation about, okay, how do we activate houses like Joseph Lloyd Manor, this grand 18th century plantation house, to talk about and emphasize the lives, the experiences, and the stories of the indigenous and enslaved people. These roundtables, they were designed as public programs, and they were really meant to be information gathering opportunities and a chance for folks to get excited, involved, and invested in this project, which we see as a multi-year, long-term endeavor. Of course, a pandemic happened, and they were initially planned for as in-person sessions, but they inevitably had to go online. But I think what's really wonderful, really actually worked out for us, because we were able to reach a much larger and diverse audience. We had nearly, I think, 700 people attending live on Zoom across all 3 programs, which was enormous attendance for us. And even more so on social media, we were able to record the programs. So it really was great to be able to do that. Each panel featured a moderated discussion, expertly led by Cordell Reeves of New York State Officer of Parks and Historic Preservation, who really did a masterful job. And each of these public roundtables, which was a webinar, they were followed by small breakout groups to really try to, in some way, have a real intimate opportunity to really talk out the content that we just learned about and give people the opportunity to reflect. So here's a screenshot of some of us. And so these small groups, they were guided by a series of pre-selected prompts that we developed, and just asked questions, just talked. And what we really wanted to do was learn, how valuable was this program? What information was new? What was interesting? But also begin to identify important themes that we could then use to drive future interpretation at the house, how we can best make this history relevant to people today. And so there's a whole report that we developed. It's online, it's on our website if you're really interested. And we gathered, all this information. We distilled all the data from Q&A, from the chat that was going on, from poll questions that we did. And so this document outlines our findings, both in terms of what is the history people really do want to learn about, and how do they want to learn about this history? What are the kinds of programs that we should do to engage them with all of this information? And I'll quickly go through some of them because I think it's really interesting what came out of this. So primarily, people wanted to learn more about the integral role of enslaved people on Long Island and the pervasive reality of enslavement here in the North and on Long Island in particular. And then, of course, the social and cultural interaction and dynamic between African Americans and Indigenous people kept coming up again and again. Of course, because of Hammond and the very religious nature of his poetry and writing, the religious context and practices and beliefs of the time. Hammond's, Christian beliefs, but also the connection of that to West African beliefs as well. And then the complexities of freedom, abolition, and emancipation was certainly one thing that was talked about. Literacy, print culture, and the transference of thoughts and ideas during the 18th century. And then finally, of course, connecting this to today. So the roots of inequality and systemic racism on Long Island. There was a lot of talk about how we connect this past to the present. And then quickly, one thing we heard over and over again was, why didn't I learn this in school? And so there was constant talk about how we can enhance augmented K-12 teaching and learning. Online programming might be interesting, especially to Walt Whitman. People want to do more of that, make these programs more accessible, to partner with organizations, continue to do that. And then also really activate the space. So not only the house, but the landscape around it. And then also bring in contemporary art as well. So we are now at this moment, after we completed this first phase of the project, that we want to start experimenting with the house. It's been closed since the pandemic started, and to bring people back to Joseph Lloyd Manor and give some physical presence to the Jupiter Hammon project at the house. We're not ready to completely reinterpret the whole thing. We need to do a lot more community engagement work and reach descendants and community stakeholders and get people really involved in the work that we do in the future. But we're starting to do some what we're calling prototypes, some pop-up interventions in the house. So one of them is a series of panels. It's an exhibition that we installed in a previously unused room in the house, and working with our advisory council and one of our historians who was on the first roundtable to go through the entire history, the entangled story of Hammond's family and the Lloyd family across generations, talking about Comset being indigenous land, Lloyd Neck being the ancestral home of the Matinicock people who are still very much present today, and talking about Hammond's paternal grandparents who were kidnapped into slavery and endured the Middle Passage, who were enslaved on the Barbados on the sugarcane plantation of the Sylvester family, and then enslaved on Shelter Island, on the east end of Long Island. The birth of Jupiter Hammond's father at Sylvester Manor and his purchase by James Lloyd, removing him from his family on Shelter Island to Boston, and then Henry Lloyd purchasing opium and bringing him to the Manor of Queens Village around the time that Henry Lloyd is constructing the first manor house in 1711, which opium, Jupiter Hammond's father, likely had a role in helping construct. And then that same year, the birth of Jupiter Hammond in 1711, he was born into slavery on Lloyd Neck, and then going into what happens to Hammond and his family in the period of gradual emancipation, Hammond likely being freed despite his wishes around 1794, and then him ultimately living in a home in near Huntington Village with his grandniece and grandnephew, Benjamin and Phoebe Hammond. And so going into that whole story at the house. And then something else that we did, so one of our panelists was actor and writer Lee Work, who I know is doing a program here as well. And during our second roundtable, one of our audience members just punched into the chat, "Can you recite an essay on slavery?" And so he did this impromptu recitation that was amazing. It was just so moving, so powerful. So really looking forward to David afterwards reciting some of his poetry. It was great to hear it. So we invited him to the house. So he is standing in a room that we believe to have been the enslaved quarter at the house. And so we had him create a audio visual interpretation that we are playing in the room, bringing Jupiter's voice back into the house. You hear him reciting an essay on slavery. He also did a cinematic interpretation of the poem as well, and this is just a screenshot from it. We did a whole program in February debuting this. It was just a really wonderful conversation with him and his collaborators. And so if you're interested, that's on our website. And so then I'm just going to talk briefly about some other things that have happened around our work with the Jupiter Hammon project. So we actually ended up getting a call out of the blue from a member, a descendant of the Lloyd family, who reached out to us, and they were really, really inspired and impressed by the work that we're doing with the project, and we're really moved by it. And because of that, they decided to gift to us their family portraits. So portraits that had been in the family for 400 years. And I'll read you a quote because I think it's just really lovely. The descendant said, "After being in family care for all these years, we believe that these portraits are going to the right place with you and your colleagues at Preservation Long Island, where we hope that they will be useful in your development of a deeper historical understanding and contextualization of the issues and events that swirled around the Long Island area in colonial times later." So it was really nice to, have a descendant really be inspired by this work and to reach out to us and gift us these portraits, which are now on display. They are hanging along the walls in our exhibition gallery called Spring Harbor, if you want to go view them. They're really amazing, incredible, and important pieces of early American portraiture. And so I did an exhibition last year called Basic Slavery, reframing the Lloyd family portraits. It goes into the connection of each of these individuals to the enslavement of Jupiter Hammond's family across generations. And I did put out a little brochure on the table there with all the label text if you're interested in learning about that. And then finally, another exciting thing that happened in the middle of all of this is that Joseph Lloyd Manor was officially designated a national literary landmark in honor of Jupiter Hammon. And this was a hybrid virtual in-person celebration, which took place on Hammond's 309th birthday. So it was just a really wonderful day to celebrate Hammond. And so we had representatives from the Huntington African American Historic Designation Council, the Empire State Center for the Book, Preservation Long Island, and our local congressman, Tom Swazi, came by as well. So Joseph Lloyd Manor has mostly been closed over the past couple of years, so we're working hard to get it open again and to invite people back on site to engage with us in discussion, in dialogue, to talk about the work we're doing, to talk about this history, what's working, what's not working. We are doing 2 open houses this summer. They're not on our website yet, but if you do want to come, they'll be open to the public. And they will be July 30th and August 6th. I'll be leading one of the tours. So I do hope that you can come and visit. And of course, we'll be doing more at the house moving forward. And I just put this QR code here. So we have a ton of resources on our website that we've developed around the Jupiter Hammon project that makes available examples of Hammond's poetry, all of the, collects all the historical archives in one place. The Lloyd family papers, they survived. Some of them have been transcribed and you can read online. Put all of those historical records together in one place to make available to folks. And a big part of this project has been going back into the archive, doing a lot of the work similar to what Robert's been doing and really focusing in on the stories of the people that the Lloyd family enslaved. So I do hope that you follow us along at Preservation Long Island. We put a ton of stuff on social media. And I hope you become members and come visit. And thank you so much.
Another breathtaking presentation. Thank you, Lauren. And another round of applause. Now, it reminds me of the similarities we have with the group that Robert started here in Huntington, the town of Huntington Historic Preservation Group, of which we belong. And so when I hear Lauren give her description of the house, it wants me to get up and give a description of our house over here too. And it's wonderful to see that we have so much in common. And we don't necessarily, we used to take turns meeting at different sites before COVID. And then we had a chance to visit all the different historic sites. Of course, that's been on hold now for a couple of years. But I certainly would like to get over there and see what you've done in these past 2 years. It's just magnificent. It comes to mind that Jupiter was born in 1711 and Whitman was born in 1819. So there was 100+ years of difference. And it was very curious when we were making the program, we were looking for a portrait of Jupiter to put in the program. And Lauren pointed out that there is no portrait. And I was a bit surprised, but now putting it into context, if you notice that, you know, photography came into being in the time of Whitman, so would have been after Jupiter, obviously. But we always like to say there isn't a camera that Whitman didn't like. So we have many, many portraits of Whitman, and it really is a shame that we don't have anything of Jupiter. And we were also gifted with the portrait of Walt Whitman. It's not historic, meaning that it wasn't in a family. It's over here on display. But the artist who painted it is a notable Connecticut artist, and he does historic figures. And so he came down last month and donated our picture and portrait of Walt Whitman, which we have. I would also like to give a shout out to one of our board members who's in the audience today, Dr. Sissy Fishbein. Let's have a round of applause. It's very instrumental in writing the brand to the humanities and putting the perspective of all the voices that we had that we studied in the program committee and asked to present. So thank you, Susan. Thank you to all the board members who may be on our Zoom today. They are certainly a wonderful support in many ways, innumerable ways, to me and to the association. As I'm sure everyone who's on a board or deals with the board understands the importance of board members. Okay, now we're going to get into the literacy and poetry part of our program. And I would like to introduce David Mills, who will be coming up in a moment after I read his bio here. Mr. Mills holds an MFA from Warren Wilson College and NYU, my alma mater. He's published for collections, Bonham, The Dream Detective, The Southern Country, and After Music. His poems have appeared in Plowshares, Brooklyn Rail, Colorado Review, Crab Orchard Review, Jubilant, Kalamazoo, The Common, Worcester Review, Brooklyn Rail, and many others. He has received fellowships from the New York FA, from Fredlow, the Poetry Society of Virginia Book Award, and a Flushing Town Hall grant. He has also received a Schornberg Library Scholar in Residence Fellowship, and the Lannan Foundation and the Queen's Council on the Arts received fellowships from that. What's that?
No,
It's waiting
it's
for me.
okay.
I see David's waiting for me. Okay, all right. Well, you'll find out for yourself. Was that a picture of David in your brochure and one of your pictures up here? David, different poet. It's a different poet. Okay. All right. Well, hold on. You can start your way up, David, but I'm not finished yet. So he lived in Langston Hughes' landmark home and was a recipient of the Langston Hughes Society Award. He wrote the audio script for the Whitney Museum exhibition, Reflections in Black, 100 Years of Black Photography. The Juilliard School of Drama commissioned his play, Serpent and the Dove. He has recorded his poetry on ESPN and RCA Records and had a poem display at the Venice Biennial. Okay, all right, David, give me patience and come on up. Well,
Yeah. I wouldn't like inspired to be more interesting than
No, I could read that for you.
Brother 16 and it's lower. Could you hear me okay before? But it might be an issue with the Zoom. Thank you all for being here on this winter weather activity. So I'm primarily a poet. Like to be in the tradition, and having is certainly the beginnings of what I had colored in this country. Writing was an illegal act that could lead to whipping, could lead to cutting off extremities. So even in the act of my writing something, there is something revolutionary within that. The book, I'm forgetting her name now. Cynthia was referring to is called Boneyard. It's the first book of poems about slavery in New York City. This is my book. Has 3 poems in it about Mr. Hammond. And of note, my research is such that that last name, because it's not Lloyd, you know, it's likely that it was referring to the curse of Ham and him being a black man. And there was also a god, an apocryphal god in the Old Testament, Ammon. And so these sort of designations were about erasure, about signifying against the black bodies of Ham. Curse of Ham, the mark of Cain. These are things when we deal with the context of 18th century New England and Long Island. There was the Great Awakening, the revivals, the Calvinists and their beliefs in predetermination or predestination, limited atonement, the select and the elect. And so anyone who was enslaved obviously would not fit in that, although ironically, there's no England, there's no New England, there's no Europe in the Bible, be it Old or New Testament, but there is Africa, Ethiopia, which Hammond refers to. So I'll touch on that a bit. And he was both informed by and reacting to that Calvinism. I like to think of him as a poet preacher, and it's interesting. There's a writer from the let's say 50s through 70s, Bob Kaufman, who I believe is the beginning of the Beats, but doesn't get the credit. And he was half African American, half Jewish American. There was a NPR series on him, and he said a poet is like a priest in that you have to renounce the things of this world to show the world what it needs to see. And it was weird because one of my majors as an undergrad was religious studies and the other was economics. And I'm like, how do I even be a poet? And I listened to Bob Calvin, I was like, boom, there it is. But on a not so light note, Hammond was a poet preacher. Undoubtedly, his calling was as a preacher. And if you read any of his work, it was using the common meter, right? So you had the 8-syllable, I'll just break it down in syllables rather than getting tetrameter trimmer. You had the 8-syllable, 6-syllable alternating line in quatrain repeatedly. That's what you hear in Methodist hymns, hymns from the Anglican Church. I don't like to refer to that song because it was actually written by a man who was a slaver, but there's a very famous hymn that I'm sure you all know that if you sing that to yourself, that is that common meter of the 8-syllable, 6-syllable that saved a wretch like me. You know what I'm talking about. So he wrote 4 prose pieces that we know of and 4 poems. The first poem published in 1760, An Evening Thought. The title was sometimes too long for me to say the whole thing. An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ with Penitential Cries, which I hope to share at least some, if not all of it, with you. The next piece he wrote, and his most prolific period was when he was taken to Hartford by, I believe it's Joseph Lloyd. During the Revolutionary War, Joseph was a patriot, the family there, descendants of the Brits, and it's important to state, you call it Lloyd Manor, but it was actually the wife of that first Lloyd, that land, stolen and bought from the native individuals, so bringing in all genders into the narrative, the erasures happened around the whole things. And so he wrote and addressed to Miss Phyllis Wheatley, his first piece in Hartford, and here we are in New York. Is what's interesting is Hartford was the publishing capital of the colonies into the 19th century. So he had 4 pieces published during that period. Technically, you could say 6. So that was like his most prolific time when he actually wasn't in Long Island. So you had the address to Miss Phyllis Wheatley, another poem, second poem. Then you had a winter piece. The Phyllis Wheatley piece came out in 1778, likely in response to her. Hammond is the first Negro that we know of to publish something, but it was broadside. So An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ with Penitential Cries, it was broadside. It was in full collection. As far as we know, this microphone is not going to be kind to me. As far as we know, Miss Wheatley is the first Negro to publish a full length in any genre. Sometimes you do the research and say, oh, she's the first Negro woman to publish something. She's the first Negro poet. She's the first Negro female poet. I haven't found anyone else who's published a full-length collection in any genre who was considered Negro or slave or less than polite terms back in those days. And the likelihood is that Hammond wrote his second poem, his second piece, and addressed to Miss Phyllis Wheatley in response both to her book, and then there's a particular poem she writes about on being brought from Africa to America. And we can get into some of the possible issues around those. But so Hartford, an address to Miss Phyllis Wheatley, 1778, a winter piece, which was his first essay, 1782. And what was interesting is he had 2 poems come out of essays. And a winter piece, a poem that was connected with it, was a poem for children with thoughts on death. He seemed to be very obsessed with death, and I don't know if it was the fact that his first publication, he's basically 50 years old, so we're moving into his late 60s. As he's becoming even more prolific, or at least in the public sense. Then he has an essay on 10 virgins, and it has nothing to do with sensuality. It's riffing on a passage from the New Testament. I believe it's either in Luke or Paul, in one of Paul's letters. I'll just hold it unless you think we can't hear me. The essay on 10 virgins came out in 1779. 1783 was an evening improvement, which was another essay, which was basically riffing on the Revolutionary War, because I think I mentioned that Joseph was a patriot. He wasn't,
Was he a loyalist?
No. He was actually, the rest of the family were loyalists, and he fled to Connecticut, to Stamford first, then to Hartford, because the British actually took over and used the Lloyd House as like a bunker, basically. So he was not a loyalist. The rest were. He was a patriot. And he actually ended up committing suicide up in Connecticut. That's because he thought that the Patriots were losing. Charleston fell, and he thought everything was done. So no, he was a patriot. Such as that is. And interestingly, in the same way with the winter piece, where we have this poem embedded in a poem for children with thoughts on death, on an evening's improvement, another piece in Hartford essay, he then has a poem that comes out of that, which is called the dialogue, the kind master and the dutiful servant, which many people think is his sort of piece de resistance. It's the most well-written poetic work. And then lastly, which was mentioned, Lauren, sorry, it's a long one. The prose piece, an address to Negroes in the state of New York, which people look at as his most definitive sort of attack on slavery and really trying to talk about freedom, but he still couched it in these sort of spiritual biblical language. And some believe it was he's having to code and dissemble what we call in the African American tradition signifying, right? So you're sort of saying something, but then it has double meaning, right? So it's like, okay, the white audience might take it on this level, but those in the know that I'm really saying this. So for example, a spiritual like Go Down Moses, maybe for a lot of whites listening to it in the 18th and 19th century, they're just thinking of it as, oh, it's just this religious spiritual song. But as the coding is signifying to the enslaved, my ancestors, that was about someone going down, as Harriet Tubman was called, the Moses of our people. Moses freeing the Israelites from bondage and slavery in Egypt. The enslaved African or the freed African going back to free those who were enslaved. So that kind of code switching, as we'll also say, he did constantly, meaning Hammond. Let me just touch on some other things before I get into some degree of specificity. I said he's a poet preacher. I talked about the common meter, the 8-syllable, 6-syllable, back and forth, and it's through all of the poems. You also have to think about it. You know, I'm a writer, and you say, oh, okay, so there are people to the writer. There was Hammond, and then it's like almost 15 years later that Phyllis Wheatley publishes the first book. So there's like nothing around it. There's just like empty black literary space, right? A gentleman named George Horton. There were only 3 enslaved individuals who published while they were enslaved: Hammond, Wheatley, and then George Horton, who actually was the first person to publish anything in the state of North Carolina. Black, white, green, or different, 1829. I think it's Hope of Liberty is the name of it, but it's some of the code switching, if you look deeper into Hammond's work, he will repeatedly use the term brethren. And as a Christian, of course, people and being gender positive, brethren and sistren, but he would say brethren. It could be taken as meaning all, but the understanding, the literary scholarship is when he would use that term, he was really referring to the enslaved. But he had a white audience, and he had this tension that the majority of the enslaved individuals he might be preaching to, because that's what he was doing often, as well as his writing, if he had an audience, would be illiterate. So they, even if they understood what he was saying, they had not read these texts. And then he had the white audience who, it wasn't that literacy was so, shall we say, much more significant relative to the black, but certainly there were going to be more white people in the audience who had read the Bible than the enslaved had, many more. And so he had to do this dance of like, they might actually have read what I'm reading or what I'm sharing, but I'm trying to kind of do this balancing act of saying, okay, I want you to get this message. You haven't read it. You might know what this really means, but I'm going to try to, you know, pull a fast one on you. I'm not being respectful when I say it. As mentioned, a very religious individual. he was often trying to upend and show up the hypocrisy of the Calvinists because they believed that they were God's elect, the white colonial settlers of all of New England and all of these what we call colonial states at the time. He had white assistants, obviously, in his publishing endeavors, and of note, Wheatley had national and international renown. Hammond didn't have that. It's a very kind of localized thing, although he was fortunate to go to Hartford. It was broadside, it was pamphlet. I mean, Wheatley's going to England, she's exchanging letters with George Washington. She actually meets the man. Hammond's sphere is much more circumscribed, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I also want you to think about the ideas of redemption and salvation as I share some of his works. What I'll do is I'll just read all or part of two of his poems. The first is the one I just mentioned, Salvation. An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ. There is my page. I'm sorry, I'm not the band. Might keep me out of the gates there for that. An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ with Penitential Cries. I just want you to keep your ear out for the word salvation, redemption, and any variation on that theme of redemption. An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ with Penitential Cries by Jupiter Hammon. Salvation comes by Jesus Christ alone, the only Son of God. Redemption now to everyone that loves his holy word. Dear Jesus, we would fly to thee and leave off every sin. Thy tender mercy will agree, salvation from our King. Salvation comes now from the Lord, our victorious King. His holy name be well adored, salvation truly bring. Dear Jesus, give thy spirit now, thy grace to every nation. That hand, the Lord, to whom we bow, the author of salvation. Dear Jesus, unto thee we cry, give us the preparation. Turn not away thy tender eye, we seek thy true salvation. Salvation comes from God, we know, the true and only one. It's well agreed and certain true he gave his only Son. It is the Lord that does supply with his redeeming love. Dear Jesus, by thy precious blood, the world redemption have. Salvation doth increase our love, our hearts have felt thy fear. Now glory be to God on high, salvation high and low. And thus the soul on Christ rely can heaven surely go. Come, blessed Jesus, heavenly dove, accept repentance here. Salvation give with tender love, let us with angels share. So in this poem that I believe is 88 lines, yes, I did say it's fast as well. He uses the word salvation 23 times. It's not by dint of chance. He uses the word redemption, redeemer, redemption, redeemed 3 times. Back to my other notes. A lot of this I have in my soul. But I get a little nervous. Like, let me go to the video safe like one. So Jesus was the Savior, right? And he was also considered a bondservant. So Hammond, using that word repeatedly, he's signifying and he's talking about connecting the African, the enslaved, with Jesus as bondservant, but also as Savior, and salvation being connected with the term Savior. I want to find something specific because there's a reference to Jehovah. It's bad here. All right. As I mentioned before, with Calvinism, we have the elect, the predestination, but redemption for Hammond was connected to everyone, right? And Jehovah was referred to as the great Redeemer. And something I found really intense that I did not know, that when white indentured servants sold themselves for indentured servitude here, coming over to the Americas, they were referred to as redemption. And when they filled out the terms of their contract, they would be referred to as having been redeemed. Hammond looked upon that as comparable to the enslaved. And so when he's referring to redemption, he's referring to the great Redeemer of Jesus and salvation. It's about being brought out of bondage. So this code switching that he's using. So for most of the white audience, they're thinking, no, it's just this spiritual level that he's having this discourse on, but he's actually also bringing it very directly to this temporal, real time space continuum, real social construct in terms of the slaveocracy that the enslaved are living under. And they will know it's that repetition is sort of saying, I'm signifying, I want you to be free. Salvation, 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 redemption, redeemer. It's not just using it as this biblical reference. He's often sort of described, when you refer to the address to the state of, to the Negroes in the state of New York, and I use this term, shall we say, well, he will sometimes be referred to by some academics as sort of being weak of spirit. Some of us will say an Uncle Tom, which means basically sort of catering to the whims of white power structure. But as mentioned, he was in his 70s when he wrote an address to the Negroes in the state of New York. And even he's in his 70s. We look at Wheatley, Phyllis Wheatley, renowned, world famous, traveling, blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe not world famous, Western world famous. And she gets married, she has a child, and her husband ends up actually going to jail. Here's this renowned writer. She dies living as a scullery maid, impoverished, and she was in her 30s. So when Hammond is saying in his 70s, I do not wish to be free, as you referred to, Laura, this is not an illogical or, shall we say, sort of step-infected Uncle Tom statement, because here's a 30-year-old woman who's whatever the equivalent of the Walt Whitman of African Americans of her day, and she dies in obscurity and in complete poverty working in a kitchen, right? There was no like safety net, if you would. So imagine being in your 70s and thinking about, okay, when he said, but for myself, I do not wish to be free. But he clearly says, I do wish this for younger Negroes. And he has appeased 2 children. And he really was an advocate. He really challenged the Calvinists because they were very much into converting children and catechism. And they didn't really actively bring that to the enslaved children of Missouri. And I appreciate the fact that, sir, that you did, kind of clarify using the term enslaved, because it does humanize them. And beyond humanizing, it's something that was done to you. It's not like you're choosing to be a writer, you're choosing to be a baker, you're choosing to be a historian. I don't think anyone chooses to be a slave, right? So it both humanizes you and it also gives a sense that it's not your agency. Someone has imposed something odious on you. Excuse me, I sometimes freak a little too, maybe not channeling heavy. So I will go on to his address to Phyllis Wheatley, which I mentioned, and he does again use the same common meter, but I want to hopefully show that coding that I speak of, like in this instance with an evening thought, it's the word salvation and redemption, it gets even more intense in the piece for an address to Ms. Phyllis Wheatley. I'll read a bit of it and then I'll try to point out where I'm going with coding and how this is a way of survival for my community then and even now. And addressed to Ms. Phyllis Wheatley. O come, you pious youth, adore the wisdom of thy God, in bringing thee from distant shore to learn his holy word. Thou mightest been left behind amidst the dark abode, God's tender mercy still combined, thou hast the holy word. Fair wisdom's ways are paths of peace, and they that walk therein shall reap the joys that never cease, and Christ shall be their king. God's tender mercy brought thee here, 'twas o'er the raging main. In Christian faith thou hast a share worth all the gold stream. While thousands pass by the sea and others settle down, God's tender mercy set thee free from dangers that come down. That thou a pattern still might be to youth of Boston town, the blessed Jesus set thee free from every sinful weed. The blessed Jesus who came down, unveiled his sacred face, to cleanse the soul of every wound and give repenting grace, that we poor sinners may obtain the pardon of our sin. Dear blessed Jesus, now constrain and bring us flocking near. Come, you Phyllis, now aspire and seek the living God. And seek the living God, so step by step thou mayst go higher, so perfect in the word. While thousands move to distant shore and others left behind, the blessed Jesus still endure and plant this in thy mind. Thou hast left the heathen shore through mercy of the Lord. Among the heathen live no more, come magnify thy God. I pray the living God may be the shepherd of the soul. His tender mercies still are free, his mysteries to unfold. Thou fillest when thou hunger hast, or pantest for thy God. Jesus Christ is thy relief, thou hast the holy word. The bounteous mercies of the Lord are hid behind beyond the sky, and holy souls that love his word shall taste them when they die. I'll stop there. What I want to point out is, if you read this on paper, he has these glosses where at the end of each quadrant, not each, but almost all of them, he'll have a reference to a biblical text. 2 Corinthians, verse 10, Romans 5, verse 21, Psalm 89, verse 6, 7, and 8. The coding, the switching, the signifying, this to me is brilliant. So like they call him a folk preacher. I mean, he clearly wasn't as learned as Phyllis. He didn't have the facility to have that because of the nature of his existence, but this was a smart individual, cannily smart. Here's why I say this. I'll just try to keep one word sheet. Okay, so he says in the poem, when God shall send his summons down, this is verse 18, and number saints together, blessed angels chant triumphant sound, come live with me forever. And the gloss is on Psalms 116, verse 15. I read five chapters in the New Testament every day. If I can, in 9 Psalms, I just have to find it. So I will read what he put as the footnote, right? Or the gloss. I hope I'm not boring you.
No, other reasons.
Other reasons? All right. Psalm 116, verse 15. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his godliness. That's what he refers to, right? I'm telling you, you can do this. Go back and look if you have some time. I had too much time with my hands, maybe. Almost invariably, a verse before, a verse after, 2 or 3 verses before, 2 or 3 verses after, there will be lines that are much more challenging of the status quo, of the oppression, that deal with what we call in our tradition liberation theology, freeing yourself from the oppressor. So again, he gives the gloss of Psalms 116, verse 15, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his godly ones. Verse 16 reads, and I quote, O Lord, surely I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your handmaid. You have loosed me from my bonds. And I'm saying you can go through, or maybe I'll share one more. So yeah, sure, this guy you just came across. Verse 10. What happened here? Verse stanza 10 from his poem to address this week. While thousands move to distant shores and others left behind, the blessed Jesus still adore and plant this in thy mind. He refers to what he states is from Psalm 89, and it reads Psalm 89, verse 1. Yes. I will sing of the loving kindness of the Lord forever. Psalm 89, verse 1. A couple of verses later, the world and all it contains, you have founded them. The north and the south, you have created them. I don't think that's by dead chance that he's trying to say, hey, look, there's northern slavery, there's southern slavery. You, God, have created this. And for those who can kind of read between the lines, I'm saying these sort of pie in the sky spiritual things, but I'm also making this indictment of slavery because I understand it is just, state in colonial America and thereafter. So I hope that was somewhat illuminating. I don't know, I felt like I should spend my time mostly on Mr. Hammond. I don't know if you feel like you have enough time to listen to my work about slavery in New York City. So
Yes.
I'll read on about Mr. Hammond. And there was mention New York has the oldest and largest slave cemetery in the United States of America. With 15,000 enslaved bodies, lower Manhattan City Hall area. The 6-acre expanse, the southern boundary is Chambers Street, the northern boundary is Duane, the western boundary is Broadway, the eastern boundary is Center. There's a museum at 290 Broadway if you want to go and see some historical facts. And outside of it are 7 burial mounds. It's odious as to why this was unearthed again, but there are 419 of my ancestors' bodies in 7 burial mounds that are outside of the museum. If you feel like taking a jaunt into the city. So this is in the imagined voice of Jupiter Hammon, and Jupiter is a Roman god of the skies, if you would. It's also a planet, so I'm playing with that. And I refer also to Dis and Pluto and Neptune and Poseidon from the Greek and Roman mythology, which are his siblings. You already know he was enslaved in Lloyd Manor. 50 years old, basically, when his first poem was published. Anglers is another term for fisher people, and I mentioned he's a religious individual, plus so there's a lot of religious traditions involved. It's called Deem Me, Picture Popser, in the imagined voice of Jupiter Hammon. 1. Deem me distant, Jupiter, Jew, Zeus, shared root, Pitter of Latin's potter, father, Pitter potter, Zeus the father, Pitter patter, make sound light, rapid, repeat. Neptune, Poseidon, Dis, Pluto, my siblings, hell and seas, cosmic, our parcels, heaven, my realm. 2. But here on the bottom of America's airy envelope, I'm just a wanderer, spinning yet held in this colonial orbit, this gravitational pull, this solar system, one of billions. 3. With his telescope wound on flickering mysteries, if only Galileo could have discovered me there on the shores of his surname, Nazareth tucked in the footnotes, between the Jordan and Mediterranean, where what I covet of anglers and God, where sudden calms and violent storms of wind and wave are normal, like my surface, where there's a brick red tempest, 30,000 miles long, this infidel, stellar bridge. 4. Stars of the skies, twinkling creatures, the firmament, Galilee's vertical sea, something my Savior can walk upon. If Galileo could prove things helio, as a child I thought I could pray to my Lord, crack the crust of my icy core. 5. Deep space, mere sea where the splash has vanished. Ganymede, Callisto, my ardent wounds, one a maiden. Me, a heavenly body, fettered to this system, colonial and solar. Yet I'm the largest planet, crawl vast enough to hold 8 others, including the one I wanted. But I lack a solid surface. This is what happens to a man who never questions his servitude. 6. Think of the orbit between an Oyster Bay estate and New York City as the orbit between Jupiter, me, and Mars. An asteroid belt, galactic scraps, the sky parasites, a circuit of genesis and suffering that brought me about thousands of millions of years ago. 7. Snag in the fabric of space-time, everywhere, invisible and baffling. I neither absorb, admit, nor reflect. Dark matter, 95% of everything. Stand before me. Encourage your eyes to adapt. In just minutes, you'll glimpse heaven, the cosmos, its snarling, displaced, dark majority. Thank you. Forgot to mention that here that we can extend the metaphors from Jupiter and King of Jupiter's planet, and the universe is supposedly 95% between dark energy, dark matter, which is not visible. So I'm using that as a kind of metaphor for my people being invisible, but and not only is it 95% of the universe, it's what pulls it together. That is analog for the presence of the gathering in society to pull it together, even if seen as invisible walking. So I think, sorry, I don't have a question thing. Or...